Hi, I'm John Atack, and this is
Uh-huh.
my good friend Joe Szimhart, and we're going to talk about culture and creativity. And this is something that fascinates me, that we are within a culture, and that if we are to think about influence and brainwashing, thought reform, all of these things, we have to first of all step back and go, what is our culture? And that leads into many questions. We've talked about the notion that cultivate, culture, cultus, to grow. That's where we are, and things that will seem quite natural to us within our culture. I remember reading a book by Shusaku Endo called The Silence, which I think Martin Scorsese has made into a film. In fact, I've seen the film, I admit it.
I've seen the film and I have read the book.
Yeah, the book. I read the book when I was about 19 or 20, and I was steeped in Japanese culture. I loved ukiyo-e, hokusai, and Maro and Hiroshige, and these wonderful artists. I knew about the idea of the floating world, how these artists lived, and I had that kind of teenage passion that you can have. And so for me, it was very strange reading this novel, because here was a Japanese Christian who still had Japanese values, not Christian values, for me. And so there were things that he took to be completely normal, which seemed very odd to me as somebody who'd grown up in a Christian culture. That was when I first realized that we are encultured. We see things from within our own culture without necessarily realizing that to somebody who's Chinese, taking milk from an animal might seem a little bit odd, and then letting it ferment and turn into cheese might seem quite disgusting. In the same way that we don't eat donkeys' penises usually in our culture, whereas it can happen in Chinese culture.
Sure.
Or eating dogs, for example, in Korea or China. But there are things that are just weird to us, or shaking your shoe at something as you might if you're a Muslim.
It's interesting about Endo, and I agree. I read his Life of Jesus, which he wrote, and it's a particularly Asian Japanese view of the Christian gospel, and also his novel The River, where these seekers go to India, and how they sort out what the meaning of life is in so many different ways. But nevertheless, the overlay is again his Japanese cultural view. Imposed on Christianity and Indian culture, which is fascinating. I mean, he's a great writer.
Yeah, I must go and read more of him. It's been a long time, and you brought up the idea that creative people have a particular vulnerability to groups, which I think is true in part because if you have an imagination, then having your imagination guided can be a lot easier.
Yeah, my way of looking at that is, and again, I go back, we've discussed this before, and my recent reading of Otto Rank and his ideas of his book, Art and Artist, which is a foundation text for understanding his approach to psychoanalysis, the way it deviated from Freud. But in any case, he had artist clients. And this is what gave him insight into this. And what he's saying there is that, once you've rejected the collective, meaning the cultural religion, to some extent the cultural values, and you start exploring to do more cutting edge thinking and personal expression, you are now individualized more, and as a result, much more anxious, because you don't have that collective sense of support, and so you might have a small group that you meet with at the local coffee house and discuss art ideas or whatever, the way they used to do at the left bank back in the late 19th century. But even that was very unstable, so you find artists having very difficult lives that are in that type of mix, that are outside the collective. They're not accepted in the salon, so to speak. And they have no desire to be, but they're out there floating around in a canoe in stormy seas and wondering if they're going to survive. So with that heightened anxiety, it's easy for artistic types to adapt to another radical collective that's outside the norm.
Yeah.
Because they feel a kinship to experimentation. And cults, if anything, or new religions, whatever you want to call them, are experimental social networks that often become authoritarian because the leaders don't know how to govern, number one, so they resort to authoritarianism. It's always the default practice of anyone trying to run any kind of an economy, whether the economy is a small family and you have an authoritarian father or an authoritarian mother. They don't know how to manage it, so then they start beating people over the head. You do what I say because I said it. And you get this kind of behavior from people that don't know how to manage their own conduct or govern, the governance part of society. So I think that artists that are anxious about their art and their identity have a tendency to adapt, the new age groups, the cutting edge groups, and Scientology presented itself as that to these people, and also gave them an immediate structure that they could begin to, a bridge that they could follow, even though it was kind of flimsy and ended nowhere. But that wasn't the point. The point was that every day they had something to do, and they felt progress because they were awarded, a pass or a flunk or whatever it was during these TRs. So or training rundowns. So I think that the point is that a lot of these groups do attract artistic types, people that want to write poetry, people that like to write in journals and reflect on the meaning of life. That kind of person is bait, for groups that offer cutting edge, not normal collective examples, which are tiresome. And your mother did it and your father did it, and you don't want to do that again. Go to church every day or whatever they do. You want to do something new and exciting. And I think that's the appeal of new religions, is the fact that they are new, and the fact that they are controversial, and the fact that there's a potential for climbing the mountain a lot faster than the slow way everybody else is doing it, that kind of thing.
Picasso said that the museums are full of the failures, that it's only the people who broke the rules, who went against the conventions, whose work we admire. Because
Picasso must be one big failure now, because his work populates every museum on the face of the planet.
He'd failed to follow the rules. If he'd done what the generation before him had done, and of course he did try to. He desperately imitated Toulouse-Lautrec, for example, which is perhaps why he had almost 20 years of starvation on a washing boat at Bateau Lavoir before his work became accepted, really through the Cubist period when he worked with Braque. But this notion that you will have to violate convention if you're going to make new work, if you're going to get somewhere, otherwise you'll get Egyptian art, 1,000 years where everything still looks the same. And so the artist, that is a part of the spirit, the novelty, the creativity, the not doing it the way it's always been done.
But again, you're talking about the prejudice of modernism, of progressivism, of making changes good.
But I think that there's some of that, right back to in the origins of the Renaissance, and the sense that, with people say like Brunelleschi with perspective, that there's something new to be discovered. That becomes, even in Michelangelo's time, the High Renaissance, we have the birth of mannerism, which will become the Baroque or Rococo. That, with Caravaggio perhaps at its height, then we'll get Rembrandt breaking away from the Caravaggisti. So and by the end of his life, Rembrandt is no longer popular, sadly, one of the greatest painters who ever lived. He can't sell work. So I think there is that, whether it's imposed by fashion from the outside or by inner necessity from the inside and the part of the artist, it is something, it's a transformation. Even if you look at say, if you looked at polyphony in music, that it starts, we can have two voices singing together, the Notre Dame period under Leonan. His pupil Parasan goes, we can have four voices. And then you get, we can use these different intervals. And then they say, well, that's the Ars Antiqua, the old art. We have the Ars Nova, the new art. Now, the new art is 14th century.
Yeah.
And then you get the Continence Angloise and on to Renaissance polyphony. And then it's all killed because the Catholic Church says, yes, you can't understand the words anymore. And, so we'll have opera, as they call it, and just single voice. So those changes are happening. That idea of novelty, they've happened very rapidly. By the time you get to the end of the 19th century, you've got some like Georges Seurat, the divisionist or pointillist, as he's called, saying divisionism overthrew the tyranny of Impressionism. And Impressionism's only been with us, for 20 years at that time. That will burst into Fauvism, Expressionism, all of these.
Signac, Seurat were basing it on the new science of how the eye works and how color works.
Yes.
They were trying to be scientific in their painting, which is always a mistake. But even back in the Renaissance, they were using what they discovered out of the Fibonacci series and things out of Arabic discoveries of Aristotle and Greek ideas of beauty was revived in the Renaissance. But these are old ideas, and they impose these things like the way you divide a canvas in a certain way. You have to put the main thing here and the other thing there, and it took a while to break up that convention. Like, El Greco broke it up quite a bit with the way he looked at reality. He stretched it. He spiritualized his spiritual figures. Yeah. He made them etherical looking, and by the way he painted, not by some kind of changing of light, but actually stretching the body around, so it's fascinating to watch this, how that works. You have Goya going into the dark nature of human being. Incredible.
I went to the Prado a couple of years ago. Wow. Seeing the Velázquez and the Goya rooms, just unbelievable, wonderful, incredible things. But those terrible night pictures that Goya made, they're right there, and really terrifying. And I think with El Greco, and I am going to say Domenikos Theotokopoulos at this point, because it took me weeks to learn that name, and you can see why they said, we call him the Greek, but that there seems to have been something psychiatrically unusual about El Greco, and I think with Goya we can see, with the his what was it called, the series about war, that series of engravings, they were the terror. I forget it, but I know what you mean. I saw all of those in a show, and just to go through that and see the barbarity. One of my friends was sort of saying, you see, he's showing what the Napoleonic troops did to the people of Spain. You go, look closely, he's showing what the people of Spain did to the Napoleonic troops as well. That the horror was just the carnage, hanging somebody upside down and sawing them down the middle, or just this horrifying.
It's interesting. Him along with Blake, they kind of predated the psychological impact of the internal human being, which led to modern art. You
very much
begin to see the introspection becoming exhibited, in these paintings. Munch's The Scream is an iconic piece that came out of that whole realm of Goya. And Soutine, another one who was kind of crazy himself, did crazy paintings, and they look crazy. They're very disturbing, but that internal aspect of the human being is expressed. You see it in some cults, they become like one body expressing the sickness of the leader in a way, whether it's the children of God doing what they did with children and, making prostitution somehow heavenly. And then, you have to the point of murdering people or committing mass suicide, the horrors of mass thinking. The cult leader sells it as something beautiful or honorable,
Yes,
to do something
transcendence.
like that.
Fine, we're going to join the hell comment.
Like that, and then we can go to Charlie Manson with his crazy ideas of starting a war, which was supposed to be great,
Helter Skelter. Have you seen the Manson The Lost Tapes that emerged just a few years ago?
No, I didn't watch them. Some of these cult leaders, like even the current stuff on Nexium, I don't watch any of that stuff now, because I remember reading about it, and knowing who he was and knowing what he did before it became big news. When Rick Ross was going through his lawsuits about it, a lot of the group was exposed then, but nobody was really paying attention because it wasn't on video, and it wasn't acted by famous actors or whatever, and it wasn't on Netflix.
Yeah.
So I don't watch any of it because it's like I'm looking at something that's regurgitated to me. It might be done very well, but I don't need to see it again. I don't need to read it again.
I take the same perspective about the Holocaust. That was a period where I read Nuremberg transcripts, and I looked at the material and watched a painful reminder.
It's awful.
And eventually I went, I've got this now. I'm saturated with it. I'm not going to understand it any better. I'm just going to distress myself.
Having said that, though, I did visit with my family members many years ago the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and it's part of the Smithsonian complex. It's very well done. You feel like you're going through history, but by the time you leave, you're crying.
Of course, yeah.
But you do learn a lot, just going through it. I mean, visually, emotionally, the history, because you have a lot of video as well as text to look at, and as you go into an actual railroad car that would have transported them to one of the camps, and you can walk through one. I mean, it's aesthetically, it's well done. It has its dour feeling, but you do sense that you've met the people that suffered.
Yes.
You feel that, but you also get the point of view of the Nazi, well presented, what they were thinking, what they thought they were doing, and they are also humanized, because there's some gray areas in there. Some of them struggled not to do what they did. So it's not a black and white experience. It's a total human experience going through that thing.
And as Hannah Arendt said, there is the banality of evil that it becomes.
It's exactly, yeah.
But there's a fascinating little documentary called Defamation, which I think is on YouTube, and it was made by an Israeli filmmaker who was presented with the term anti-Semitic, and he went, "Oh, I wonder what that means." And he went and asked his grandma and got some really, riotous stuff from there about, any Jew who doesn't live in Israel is a criminal, and so on and so forth. Then he went and spent time with the Anti-Defamation League, who for some reason believed that, he was one of them, sort of thing, and that what they were putting forward is absolutely sensible and practicable. And he got insight, as a fairly neutral observer, an Israeli, into a process that becomes cultic. And one part of it is the way that Israeli schools send adolescents to see the reconstruction of the death camps. It's important to say that Mr. Leuchter, Mr. Death, was wrong in his analysis of his scrapings from the gas chambers at Auschwitz, because, of course, the Russians leveled Auschwitz and it was rebuilt.
Yeah.
But these students, it's quite remarkable seeing these happy, cheerful students going on the coach and arriving there and seeing the devastating effect it has upon them. Mm. And then the Mossad guard who's with them and has done many of these tours, talking to the filmmaker and saying, I don't know why we do this.
Yeah.
Making these kids hate the rest of the world and believe. There's an astonishing little conversation between some Polish guys and these two Israeli girls, and the Israeli girls get really angry with them. And afterwards, the filmmaker goes up to them and says, "Why did you get angry?" So, well, they called us monkeys and donkeys. And he said, "Well, no, we had a translator. They asked you do you come from Israel? That's all they said. So that they were being wound up emotionally to have a reaction. And they were being told directly, non-Jews will do this to you again. Don't trust them. You know, this astonishing, this astonishing way of using this information, rather than saying, we as humans must not do this. Not only mustn't we do it to other humans, we mustn't do it to animals. I'm not a vegetarian, but we should treat animals with respect, particularly if we're going to eat them. And the reason I bring up the Manson Lost Tapes is because it's one of those exceptional pieces. What happened was a filmmaker went to Spahn's movie ranch the week after Manson and the others were arrested, interviewed the remaining members of the family. And it is one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen. You've got these 15-year-old girls with buzz cuts. They've just cut their hair. They've all got guns. They're all ready for helter-skelter. Then they went and interviewed them these many years later. The film was just put in the can and left in a garage. And suddenly it became available. They went and found, I think, 3 of these girls and interviewed them as women in their 60s, 70s. And you've got the underlying story of the horror of the way that Manson behaved towards them. So watching 6 hours of wild, wild country to find out that the privileged elite of the Bhagwan Rajneesh cult lived in a certain way without finding out anything about the daily life. Right. 19-hour days that were being put into making Rajneesh Puram. It's kind of interesting, but I take your point of view. I have been awash with this material for so many decades. I have a certain amount of time left, and I'd like to learn something with the time I have. And so, I'd rather read about something that I've never read about. I'd rather find out something else.
For instance, the psychiatrist I work with, and he's from India, he was fascinated with Wild Wild Country. He says, you got to see this, because he knew about my work, and we have lots of conversations about that. And so I did. I watched it in one stretch, 6-hour stretch. I just sat through the whole thing. Yeah. It was well enough done and I knew enough about it that I could just carry through. And then I went back and explained to him what was missing from it. And he said, I would have never thought that. For instance, little things like, Rajneesh having allergies to perfumes and stuff, and having scent tests. Yeah, people had to be smelled before they could come near him.
Sniffers,
the sniffers. But that kind of detail was left out. Also, how they treated the children wasn't really placed. They were kind of like in the way, while the parents trying to get enlightened. Kids are just farmed into collectives. Doing stuff with babysitters, and so there's no real nurturing of the child in a cult like that, and that wasn't brought up very well.
Same in transcendental meditation, the same in Scientology, in my experience. That I've talked with people who grew up in Scientology. One woman, she was one of 80 children who were being looked after by a single adult, and when she was 10 years old, they went to the seaside, and her 8-year-old brother drowned. Because of the lack of supervision, and kids just running wild. The Mexican ranch with scorpions where they kept Scientology kids, until eventually David Miscavige decided you can't have kids, and so you now hear about hundreds of women who are getting over really what are enforced terminations, not things that they wanted to do. And I imagine that is psychologically
we talked about that. That's some of the carryover that people deal with. The guilt, the shame carries over. It doesn't end. You bring up this thing about the artistic creative spirit. They're going in to learn more creativity, as I did, thinking that the Theosophical path influenced quite a few artists in their day, and poetry and so forth.
Nicholas Roerich, that you
Roerich was the one artist that was most theosophical, because he started his own Theosophy Society called Agni Yoga.
Yeah.
And but even Mondrian and Kupka were involved in it, and I liked their work.
I think I personally have a tremendous grudge against Mondrian, because the neoplastic theory that he wrote, because as an art student, I read what the artists wrote. I was interested in critics and historians. And the theory of the doctrine of neoplasticism is one of the great obstacles to art in the 20th century. This man says art must be non-objective. Yes. And at that point, people like Kandinsky were just pushed to the wall because you could see things in their work. So you had to, and he even got to the point with Van Doesburg in the De Stijl group where he banished him because he'd hung a canvas on the diamond.
Oh, wow.
So the authoritarianism of Mondrian, for me, he's a ridiculous character who brings in this Schoenmakers, isn't it? This side shoot of theosophy, and then seeks to impose it upon us. And he was successful. That many explorations in abstraction, probably about 99% of what abstraction could have been doing, or abstractive art as well, where you take from something that is real and take it away from the real, so it's not recognizable. That was closed down through a kind of
I was thinking, he gave a lot of impulse to movements like the Bauhaus, and but so did Klee and Kandinsky to some extent. They taught there.
Yeah, it's more for somebody like Ittens at the Bauhaus, or later on the op artists like Anuskowitz, who were Bridget Riley, even, who are influenced by Mondrian's "You're not allowed to do this."
Yeah, I'm thinking of supremacism, that kind of art.
Malevich,
Malevich and them, took off on that to some extent, but again,
Malevich predates Mondrian. Malevich's theory is before
interesting.
Mondrian paints anything abstract.
But they're almost in the same, that abstract territory, non-objective art. Yeah. And then of course we ended up with black canvas and the white canvas.
Yep. Well, he started off with it. I think Malevich painted his first one in 1913, but while Mondrian was still painting trees,
Yeah. So what I'm thinking here is, even the art, making a cult or a closed system of your art theory can squelch the creative process. Yeah. Especially for anyone but the founder of that particular style. The imitator becomes squelched. And you have someone like Gurdjieff, for instance, that attracted a lot of creative people. He liked artists. Actually, Gurdjieff would give money to poor artists randomly, which is one of his few very kind aspects. Yeah. But he also
Catherine Mansfield to death, But
he took somebody like Araj, who was a great writer, journalist, and his creativity left him when he joined Gurdjieff. Yeah. So you have that aspect of they're there to help you create yourself, to create a soul, so to speak, which is Gurdjieff's idea, that you had to go through these shocks, these octaves, in order to self-remember yourself as an eternal being. Yeah. And I hark back to Gnosticism and what he gleaned from Sufism. But anyway, the people around him were left in shatters. Yeah. He was he was ruthless. He was brutal, and the creativity just went out the window.
I mean, my one little Gurdjieffster had a very close friend, and he insisted that it was a good idea to eat the whole of a chicken carcass because Gurdjieff had said that would proof you up. Pointing out to him that veterinarians say never feed chicken bones to your animal because they are sharp and pointed and can go through. It's like, but it'll toughen you up. It may you may have
Gurdjieff was he was a master spellbinder. I mean, he used what we call hypnosis or influence communication. He was very good at this, and he was pathological enough where he was intriguing to people that met him. They either hated him, thought he was a jerk, or they got wrapped up into his oeuvre, into his milieu.
And that is what we might call charisma. That same way. I mean, a friend of mine saw the Iceman Cometh, the play, in the West End, and he didn't know the name of the actor. He'd never heard of the actor, but he said this actor walked on stage and the whole audience stopped. Just walked on stage, didn't do anything. And the actor was Kevin Spacey. And despite his recent difficulties, and I don't think he's actually been proven guilty of anything as yet.
I don't know, but he has that.
He won the case that was brought against him, but he certainly has that presence. I know Max Weber and the sociologists say, well, charisma is a created thing, and I accept that too. certainly any charisma L. Ron Hubbard had was created. But there are people who can, like Gurdjieff, assert themselves in a room full of people, and everybody is silent. You know,
Yeah.
they have that.
Yeah, they can take over a milieu. Well, you know, you take somebody like Donald Trump, he takes the oxygen out of the room, whether you hate him or like him.
Yeah.
Because he's that kind of a figure. And I think that's what charisma in that sense does. It sets up this tension. And you either think he's an asshole or you think he's brilliant, you know, but nevertheless, you're going to have an opinion of that person because they have this presence about them. And I think Gurdjieff had that, you know, like when I first went in 1966 to see the Doors in concert in Philadelphia, when Jim Morrison came out on that stage, everybody went into a hush, you know, but because I didn't expect it. It was like, wow, this guy had, you know, is like heavy. He's really heavy in the old term, you know, we used to use this as hippies. But that was
certainly the Isle of Wight, and he was very subdued because he was just about to go on trial in Florida for indecent exposure, and it's actually held to be one of the great recorded performances because by that time, you know, by 1970, he was well known for getting drunk before going on stage, and you know, but he was totally sober, totally fixed, and the band gave an astonishing performance.
Wow. Yeah, lucky.
Yeah. Oh, Hendrix, you know, everybody saw Hendrix, and it's like when he arrived in England 2 days after he arrived, he'd said to Chas Chandler, you know, okay, I'll join your thing if you'll introduce me to Eric Clapton, you know, I'll come to England if you'll. So 2 days after he arrives, he's pushed onto the stage. I think it was Cream's second gig, and Clapton came off the stage while they were playing, and he was shaking so badly that he couldn't light his cigarette. And Hendrix had that effect on the whole London music scene.
Interesting. Yeah, he had it. He had that thing, whatever that is.
And yet on stage was a very shy, quiet man, you know, until his later years.
Yeah, fascinating. But that I think, you know, musicians have their cult followings. So you can learn something about charisma and how a cult leader operates within their milieu just from looking at that kind of. And you know, they're not all alike, and charisma isn't the same thing with everybody.
No, and I think that's a very important point. Morrissey went on tour with David Bowie, and he left the tour. And when he left the tour, he said everybody goes to Bowie's dressing room at the end of the gig. Just not charismatic enough, mate, you know.
Yeah. By the way, before we quit this, people might ask, this painting behind me is of my daughter Lonnie. I did 7 years ago, and it's called Daughter Number 3. Of course, she's adopted. She's from China, and she is my third daughter. But the painting is 4 feet tall, but it represents the idea that in that culture, ancient China and even today, they don't name their daughters. They don't get a name till they're older. And so in Chinese, they're daughter number 1, daughter number 2, and daughter number 3. So even there, you know, when you think about us in America or in England, we prize giving names to our kids. In some cultures, they don't.
And we often don't understand what those names mean. So we have a great tendency to use Hebrew names. My name, all of my children have Hebrew names, in fact.
Mine as well. Joseph means he shall add in the Hebrew.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, which is the, I go by John, Jon, but Jonathan is what my birth certificate says. And that means gift of God. And I think.
Of course. We can all see that.
So, I mean, in Scientology, of course, you have the very deliberate recruitment of celebrities, as they call it, and that promotion, and that there's very strong policy. If you influence a celebrity in any way to put them on Scientology, then you will be faced with a committee of evidence or a court of ethics, and it will be determined that you're a suppressive person if you've upset them in any way. And so they've, you know, we know about the actors and the musicians, people like Chick Corea, Tom Cruise, John Travolta, but there are many painters involved. And there was a point in Hollywood where there really were a lot of people who'd been involved in Scientology and Tom Cruise was insisting that you couldn't actually do a movie with him unless you read the book Dianetics, which is 400 turgid pages. The Incredible String Band, I had the great good fortune to meet Robin Williamson, who I think is one of the most brilliant songwriters of his generation. And they were wonderful. They were so delicate. They were so mischievous and light. They drew upon actual folk music. They were the first people in this kind of rock field to be doing that. But I met Robin 4 times over the years and spent a few hours with him here and there. And it's devastating to look back over his remarkable career and say that probably Scientology is what got in the way of stardom, because they were selling more records than the Rolling Stones in the 1960s. They performed at Woodstock and their management decided that it wouldn't be good for them to be in the film. So a couple of clips and their career just nosedived. The last time I spoke with him, which is about 10 years ago or more, he was just saying it was a fraud, wasn't it? It was this terrible thing. But as you look back over his songs, or Mike Herron's songs, there are so many references that any Scientologist, if not for the plan of the magic man who finally got me out of the woods, there's so much that's, built into this belief that, yes, we're seeing the world anew. We have this different group that we belong to, and we're going to, clear the planet. We're going to have this great achievement, which all sort of fizzled out. As a poet, which is, I admit it, I write poetry, which I've been doing and with some seriousness since I was 13, though publicly admitting it's another thing altogether. But of course, I look back to the work that I wrote during the 9 years I was involved in Scientology, and it's pushed in a certain direction. It's supportive of those ideas. For me, the great thing about leaving, I had no struggle. The day that I decided that I didn't want to believe in it, for me was a red letter day. It was a great day. Because, and through the next year, I just felt fairly euphoric that I didn't have to conform my thinking to anybody anymore. And it actually, I think it can be a very good thing to have been through a cult experience, because it takes you away from your childhood conditioning and the social conditioning that's there. And you can step back and go, well, I believe this, I don't believe that, I think this. And you can change your beliefs at will. There's this wonderful thing.
You're bringing up something really important here. And I just noticed it again. Patrick Ryan and I was featured more, we're on this Inside Edition piece that came out about QAnon, and how to get someone out of a cult is what the title was, and it's an Inside Edition gets a lot of, it was a digital online thing. It wasn't in their television program, but it got quite a bit of attention, and so there's a lot of remarks. You can listen, you can see the thing, and there's just dozens and dozens of people making remarks after having seen it. Most of the remarks are very silly. They're almost, maybe some of them are QAnon people, like, things like, well, come and join my cult, or wow, they were just like dismissive kind of anxious reactions to this very serious problem of what happens when people get involved in that. What it reminded me of was that most people don't really want to know about it, or they feel like their beliefs, which might be strange, are now being assaulted by this idea of a deprogrammer or idea of an interventionist that's going to, quote, correct the way you think. And people get very, very sensitive and unnerved by that idea that there's someone out there like that that's going to ruin everything for you. You think that the full moon effect is real. You can see it in police departments and hospitals, and it isn't. It's a total fabrication of the human mind. There's some, change in behavior when you can have more light at night. Yeah, of course, but that can be a street light. It doesn't have to be the moon. And but when I present evidence to people, like in the hospital where I work, psych hospital, 9 out of 10 of them believe in the full moon effect, and they keep saying it must be a full moon, we're busy, and then I point out, no, it's really a 3/4 moon. you know, and because I did a spread study on it, for instance, of 3 years, and the admission rate during the full moon, the day before and the day after, was no different statistically than any other day in the hospital.
Yeah.
You know, so there you go. You know, the facts bear it out. There is no full moon effect. However, in the psychology of the people, even administrators in some hospitals would bring in more staff during a full moon, expecting it to be that way. So they're wasting money, you know, in a way.
Yeah.
But this is how pervasive this belief is, especially among fire departments and police departments and hospitals. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, and we live in a culture which is full of urban mythology, and getting to that point, somebody said that he didn't have any belief that he wouldn't gladly change in 5 minutes when presented with the evidence. I have come to rejoice in cognitive dissonance. When somebody disagrees with me, and they do so agreeably without shouting at me or calling me names, I actually now relish that feeling. So, you know, having conversation with you, or talking with Pat Ryan, or with Steve Hassan, or many and several people that who know me well enough to be able to say, well, I don't agree with that. And being able to go away and think about something again and look at it in a different light, that's something that I now welcome. But it took an awful long time to get to that point and say, actually, what I like is evidence. What I like is, you know, I particularly like it when you can sort of reconstruct the evidence to mean something different. And the example of that simple one is Raymond Dart, who was a professor at Witwatersrand University, who in 1925 brought forward the tongue baby. And he had this whole thing about the Schwarzkrans. I love these Afrikaans words, the Schwarzkrans caves, where they'd found these tusks of something like a saber-toothed tiger, and they'd found hominid relics showing that how he interpreted it was that these tusks had been picked up as weapons by hominids to then cave in the skulls of other hominids, and that was phenomenally important. Konrad Lorenz's work on aggression came out of that. The whole went all through biological sciences, the idea that human beings are a vicious, aggressive creature. In 1977, a man called Bob Brain, who had succeeded to the chair at Witwatersrand, investigated the Schwarzkrans finds, and he had his students go out with they'd made some tusks up, and go out and dig up roots with them. And then he analyzed using electron microscope the tusks they'd found with the hominids, and he found that they were there because they'd been used to dig up parsnips.
Interesting.
And when they looked at the skulls that had been damaged they found there were 2 tusks involved. So it was the animal that had done this. And the whole, you know, we then get the possibility to look at human beings being possibly more like bonobos than like chimpanzees, and possibly not necessarily viciously, psychopathically aggressive.
But by the way, bonobos also can become aggressive. That's been shown.
Oh, for sure. But they're normal.
They're not unlike chimpanzees. So
the difference, as I understand it, is that if you take a chimp pack and it encounters another chimp pack, the males will seek to kill all of the other males. If you have a bonobo pack and there aren't many of them left, meeting another bonobo pack, then the males will shout at each other while the females go and have a cup of tea together, and then they'll go hunting for a month together. And you don't have the alpha male is the only one that can have sex. Though, of course, lady chimpanzees do slink off into the bushes with other males. It has been seen. But bonobos, sex is initiated by the female, more likely. And one of the things that fascinates me is, though they are sexualized almost from the moment of birth, there is no incest among bonobos. You know, that they have this natural restraint, which is fascinating. But
it is fascinating. You know, when you look at that whole thing, and I tried to in my small way, but you know, we have the aggressive chimp gene as well as the matriarchal thing going on all over human culture. So,
But, yeah, I
it's mixed in.
Evolution is a new subject. Evolution was reborn about 20 years ago, and the Mendel-Dawkins model of genetics is gone. So there's what's called evolutionary development now. Evie Jablonka's Evolution in Four Dimensions is a phenomenal textbook. I'm very fortunate the last 5 years to have worked with Yuval Laor, who is steeped in evolutionary development. What this means is that the whole idea of modules developed on the savannah and we behave in this way because it's set, that's gone. That in fact, evolution is happening right now. So even the notion of genes and what genes are is now up for question. So things that have been written as truth in our textbooks, younger biologists under the age of 40 will generally reject all of that stuff that we've...
See, this is what drives conservatives crazy is you can't trust science. That's what they're saying.
Yeah.
So they go to the default position is trust their own instincts.
Yes.
Which again is about as bad as you can get, because human instinct is often wrong because it's superficial very often.
Yeah.
It reacts to the superficial stimulus in the environment and not the the superior causes that go on out there. So it's fascinating, but that's, you're bringing up exactly why conservatives and fundamentalists don't trust evolutionary theory.
Yeah, and the point is that with science, it develops, as with Raymond Dart and Bob Brain, to how we interpret evidence. It's not a fixed set of beliefs. It's not a religion. No. It's a method of inquiry. And how wonderful to be able to say, well, we were wrong about the moon and our conservative views of the moon. Let's do something a bit more sensible. We'll waste less money. We'll waste less energy.
Right.
And we'll create a safer world. I mean, understanding that we are actually evolving through our culture and language, not simply, I suppose the simplest way to say it is that the presumption in the Dawkins model is that genes are read-only. They're just coming along and they're making themselves, and then you get the meme theory based upon this, which is also wrong. Genes are not read-only. You can write on them. And that means that in any generation, the modules are not really there. And it means that we have far more control of our destiny than that traditional view of evolution holds. I think since epigenetics started to be proved in the 1970s, and Dawkins has never really accommodated that epigenetics has been proved, that if your granddad ate too many burgers, you can get fat, even though you don't eat too many burgers. So. But then you
you go back to the wisdom of the ancient Jews that the sins of the father are passed down to the fourth generation.
Yeah,
think about that.
Yeah,
and that's almost like something that's instinctually, if you want to call it that, known and observed. It was an observed thing. When you think about it, they would have to observe that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that fascinated me in the late 80s, gene transfer was seen between a caterpillar and a bush that it was eating. So genetic modification.
That to me is just incredible, just to see what you just said.
Yeah,
the interspecies interaction can change them to benefit or to repel one another, depending on what their built-in needs are.
Yeah.
So,
and
listen, I've got to go here pretty soon.
Yeah. Well, it's been fascinating. Let's wind up here, and we'll have a quick word after we end the recording. I'm John Atack.
Okay.
Been a great having Joe Szimhart here.
This is Joe Szimhart signing off. Also, thank you, John. This was fascinating. Once again.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.